Negotiation is as much what cards you have as it is how you play the hand. We certainly have looked a lot into it over the last 30 years, and it's a trained skill that will improve your performance. But the second is a line that we like to say a lot in our training, which is nothing convinces like conviction.
Welcome to Everyone's Talking Money, where we get brutally honest about money, mindset, and making life richer. Andres, why do so many high-achieving professionals still feel uncomfortable advocating for themselves? And how do we start shifting that?
That's a great question, and I think there's a lot there. But if you think of any negotiation, and certainly salary is one of them, the fear from negotiation starts from number one, you don't know what's going to happen, right? You go down this path and you're not sure what the result's going to be, number one. Number two is you're thinking, if I push too hard, I could damage the relationship. And so there's this fear to push too hard that it could strain. And again, in a negotiation, that's the case, but in salary, that's literally your employer. So the relationship continues, and if it's strained, there's an impact there. But then you start to think, if I don't push hard enough, then I'm leaving money on the table. And especially early on in your career, that starts to compound. So if you're thinking first salary and you multiply that over all these years. And so I think all those together give you that, some level of anxiousness. And so I think what I'm excited to talk about today is that is true and that does happen and that's natural, but all the ways that folks can either not necessarily avoid that, but manage that, and the tools that you can use and leverage in order to get better results, increase confidence, and those sorts of things.
How much of negotiation is truly about skill, and how much of it is about belief in your own value?
So that's an interesting question, and I think it's in a little bit like poker. Negotiation is as much what cards you have as it is how you play the hand. And so I think there is some skill for sure. And not only is there skill, but we certainly have looked a lot into it over the last 30 years. And it's a trained skill. So some folks are more inherently, start at a higher level, if you will. But it's certainly something that can be trained. And so that combination is really there. When I think of it, there's kind of two responses to that. One is a skill component that will improve your performance. But the second is a line that we like to say a lot in our training, which is nothing convinces like conviction. And so it is as much about the value that you bring to the table as an employee when you're negotiating your salary as it is about the conviction with which you communicate it, and then the other side kind of receives it, if you will. So that is a combination, and very much like I said about what your cards are in poker, but also how you play the hand.
So when entering a negotiation, obviously we have to do some research ahead of time, right? To know what we're asking for is realistic. And oftentimes it's salary, right? But people aren't comfortable talking about money. So how do you go about researching so then you can have the data to back up what you're asking for?
For sure. So the first thing is you have to, preparation is the only way you're going to be successful in negotiations, and there's just no way around it. And so really there's now more than ever, there's all these amazing tools to find that information out, the Glassdoors of the world, pay scale, all these industry association informations. And so all of that together allows you to kind of get, some precedent, if you will. The same way if you're buying a house, you'd look, hey, what did that same house sell for earlier? What do the neighbors sell for? And so you want that information. And so once you start getting armed with that information, then the second part is kind of setting out your strategy for negotiating the most successful outcome. And that really could be that you might have all that information to help you understand, prepare, and guide your strategy, but you may not necessarily have to use it all. And what do I mean by that? In salary negotiations in particular, so there's some where you want to go first and you want to anchor, and there's some where you don't want to go first because you're not sure where they're going to go. In salary negotiations, it's often, not always, it's often better to let them go first, but it's better to kind of set some of those anchors out. And so I think this will help folks that are saying, I'm a little bit afraid to bring up that particular offer. How do I do that? Well, you could do something in between, right? You look at all those different pieces of information, and let's say you find that a reasonable comparable for your role is $75,000. I'm making that up. Well, then maybe rather than saying, look, I want to be paid $80,000 because you may feel uncomfortable because, 75 is the comparable. You got to ask for a little bit more to get to 75. You're asking for 80. You're not sure. You're working yourself up for it. Well, another way of the idea might be to lay out 3 or 4 comparables you found that when I did my research on PayScale, on Glassdoor, and all these other places, and I looked at other information, similar businesses in this area, I found the comparables were between $75,000 and $85,000. And then you do the hardest thing, which is cover your mouth and say nothing else, right? And so you're not asking for 75 to 85 in that example. You're just simply laying out what is really objective information about the information you found. And so I think that's one way you can kind of manage all of those things in preparation, which you cannot avoid, but also maybe not asking for it as much as kind of setting the tone with some anchors and some objective data that can then guide the conversation thereafter.
And do you find those resources, Glassdoor and all, accurate when it comes to this salary information or benefit information?
Ish would be my response to that. So I think I certainly would put all mags in one basket, that you find one Glassdoor amount and you go with it. But I think if you look up the salary.com, the pay scale, the Glass, all of these together, and you start to look at it, I think you can start doing some trend lines around what's this position pay. And also, it does do a good job of also adjusting based on where you are geographically. And so, for example, that data is pretty worthwhile. The cost of living in New York City is much higher than, it might be in New Orleans, for example. And so that kind of information can be helpful. And again, so that's really to arm you, but that shouldn't be your only really, piece of information you share. So it may be the way you anchor it. Because remember, after all of this, if you think back, when you're negotiating your salary, you're not necessarily saying, this is kind of what the value is for others, but you're also saying this is how you're able to justify paying this, right? I'm worth at least this much to the company. So you do have to kind of combine it with, your value and more future prediction of what value you'll bring to the table, not just past value of what others have in kind of those precedents, if you will. So that's the balance that you're trying to make sure you accomplish.
With women especially, there's a fear of being too pushy, right? Because if we're too out there, we're pushy, and we're not, and the line may be different, right? For men versus women. So where does the fear of being too pushy come from? And how do we start dismantling that narrative?
Well, it comes from a good place, I think, which is women. Certainly, there's lots of research to indicate this, that women are more empathetic. And so that's really where this comes from, right? So if you had zero emotional intelligence and no empathy whatsoever, I could say, I could ask for any amount of money and feel nothing. And even if you shut me down, still feel nothing. And to some extent, having no emotional intelligence is problematic in many ways and probably is going to limit your success in a role, but will be very good for salary negotiations as far as long term, right? And so it does come from a good place. That empathy, really what's going on there is, when we started the conversation, we talked about kind of the fear of pushing too hard and the damage of the relationship. And that's really the forefront. And there's more of a focus generally for women than it is for men. So it comes from a good place. And so really, then if you want to manage that and balance that out, then I think some of the things that you absolutely have to do is you have to prepare, in the sense that all those comparables. Probably should, even preparation should include some sort of role playing and scripting as well. Because what happens is, generally for everyone, and particularly women, where there might be some less confidence or more fear of damaging the relationship, and more kind of care there, is that in your mind you're prepared, okay, I'm going to ask for this, I'm going to do this. And when you get to the actual conversation, then you lower that a little bit, right? You're not asking for 85, you're asking for 75. You're not saying, I absolutely need this. You're instead saying, it'd be nice to have, right? You soften all the words. All these things start to happen. And so a combination of scripting and role playing that, and role play could be with a friend, a spouse, significant other, whatever it may be, or even just kind of saying it out loud to yourself. What you want to do is you want to create the actual situation, or as close as you can. So when you get there, you feel more comfortable. And it goes back to nothing convinces like conviction, right? If you don't believe you're worth X, there's absolutely no way you're going to communicate that in a compelling way to the other side. And so I think that's kind of where it comes from. It comes from empathy, which is a great thing. And so I think the preparation phase, we always talk about, that allows you to kind of make sure that you don't get anchored, make sure that you follow the strategy and script. And so that's really where it starts, because in the moment, there's very little you can change at that point, right? It's all the pre-work that's been done that's going to help you get those results.
And I think too, the initial conversation, especially for women, you may start off strong and confident. And then if the face is on the other side, whether it's on the computer screen or the other side of the table, if maybe they're not giving you exactly what you want, or you start getting in your head, you start to like soften your words, as you said, like just bring it down, and then you keep going and going and going. And I'm guilty of that. I don't have the ability to stop, because I think, well, I need to finish all of my thought and get exactly out what I wanted to say. How much does that hurt you when you're having a conversation, whether it's negotiations or you're making a sale or you're trying to bring on a new client? How much do all of those extra words, extra sentences end up hurting more than helping?
Yeah, so much there. I mean, first of all, generally being succinct, the more you say, the more the message gets lost, right? Which is kind of ironic, right? So if you were to say one phrase, I believe I'm worth $70,000, and that's all you were to say, obviously that conveys something very specific, very clearly. And if you say a lot of things before and after, then that kind of starts to, really take away the impact of what you said, right? So if you think of it that way, being concise and succinct is helpful. And I think all of this comes to one of the very interesting pieces about this is, although we were founded by two gentlemen, in particular, one, Ron Shapiro, was one of our founders 30 years ago. The reason he created the Shapiro Negotiation Institute and kind of his three-piece process, which I can talk about for a second, because I think it certainly applies here, was he wanted to be kind of provide the ultimate equalizer, that whether you were a minority or you were a woman or you were early on in your career, you had less training, for those folks that didn't necessarily feel like they didn't have that confidence and conviction to give it to them. And following a process allows you to do that. If you follow the steps, it does that. And so the three P's were prepare, which is the only aspect of a negotiation over which you have control, which is asking a lot of questions. And here we haven't talked about that yet, but you really can't think of any negotiation without doing a lot of probing and asking questions. Right? Negotiation really should not be about you just making your demands. It should be a lot of asking questions around understanding what their needs are, potentially what are their objectives for the negotiation? How can you accomplish these things together? And they help to kind of put you on the same side. You might be on the same negotiating table, but rather than negotiating against, you're negotiating with. And good questions allow you to do that. And then finally, some kind of proposal guidelines that can help you. So those three-piece process is really what he created exactly for this reason, so that, when you get that down that road, and the one thing that ties us all together then is a really important phrase that I think is important, that you said earlier, that you start kind of the right way, and then over time, the longer the negotiation goes, the more kind of fumbling and fear and anxiety and discomfort there is. And so that is that negotiation is a process and not an event. And so when you're thinking about the negotiation and you're preparing for the negotiation, it's not about here's my opening and then away I go and everything will go great. It's really about thinking, okay, if you're prepared and thinking, I'm not going to take this job for less than Y, I'm going to ask for X, all these things you're thinking, well, that allows you then, if you know it's going to take multiple steps, right? Very little of these get accomplished. You don't say, Shari, I'd like $70,000 for this job. Okay, sounds good. Shake hands, and then it starts the next day, right? That's very rare. So if that mindset is that it's a process, not an event, that it'll take weeks, months, however long it'll be, that certainly will calm you, because it's less surprising when you say no or not yet. And that also starts to help you prepare for that whole negotiation. For example, it's not uncommon for people to say, look, I think you're worth every penny of $75,000. However, our budgets are tight right now. We've been going through some layoffs, and so we can't give it yet. So if you're thinking of negotiations as a process, not an event, you'd be right to say, okay, I understand that, but I want to make sure that we're not sitting here next year still in the same position. So what's the timeline and set of actions we can put in place now to make sure that 6 months from now, then that kicks in, or there's a plan in place to make sure that this doesn't go by the wayside? Well, that would be a very different response than being very disappointed and kind of walking away thinking, I failed here. And so that's the kind of, the mindset you really absolutely need to have in order to make sure that you're not just trying with one strong push and then kind of hoping the rest will follow.
So would you say that the mindset shift of understanding this is a process, this is not necessarily a one-time event, is what really differentiates people who get what they want through negotiations and those that don't?
I think that, and then combined with during that process being comfortable with the uncomfortable, right? And so the harder, the more complex the negotiation, the more uncomfortable moments there be. Maybe it's a moment of silence at a critical time. Maybe it's not hearing back from the other party for a week or two. Maybe it's first getting a no. And so it's that combination of, because really, if you're thinking about it as a process, not a one-time event, that means there's a level of patience there. So you've got patience, and you've got kind of the discipline to continue to follow up. You're managing your emotions. That's another thing we haven't talked about, is really, really important. All of those combined, but I think that's really the combination that helps you. You do have to be uncomfortable, or comfortable with the uncomfortable, because there'll be moments. Otherwise, it's too easy, right? If you ask for something and they say yes quickly, not only did you leave money on the table, but you certainly will feel that way. Ironically, you're actually going to feel less satisfied, thinking, "Oh goodness, I could have asked for 20% more than that." And in general, if you're pushing, but you're doing it not in an aggressive way, you're pushing in a nice way, in a collaborative way, where you're also thinking about them, right? Where would they get this budget? What other responsibilities could you add to your role to get that raise? What data could they use to justify this internally? So it isn't just about you. You've got to be thinking about how they're going to justify it and how they're going to help you accomplish your goals.
That is true. There is a fine line between that was too easy and I probably didn't ask for enough. They got off well on it. The other side won, if you will. And I'm waiting too long and it's uncomfortable. There is a fine line between that. So there's a saying, and I'm going to butcher it a little bit, but like both sides, when you're negotiating, ends with feeling like they're losing. And that's like a successful negotiation. Is there truth behind that?
I think there's, some concessions are made. I do think there is some truth there. I think hopefully the way we're approaching it, and there's a great model in this that talks about, essentially how much you care about the relationship in one axis, and then how much you care about the outcome in another. And so what happens is, most people think of negotiating in that middle piece, which is you kind of both compromise. So I give up some things I care about, you give up some things you care about, and so none of us are thrilled when we get to a decent result. And that's kind of what that statement is about, and that's okay. But I do think, and in some situations, that's realistic as good as you're going to get, where they're not that complex, right? You want something, I want something very similar, and so there has to be some, right? You're buying a car from a private purchase of a car, right? The reality is how much you pay, when you pay. There's not that many variables, and so to some extent, it's going to feel that way. But if you think of most negotiations, and I think we should really go here also that let's call the compensation negotiation rather than the salary negotiation. And why do I say compensation? Well, if you think about you're negotiating your next role, it's not only the salary, but it's the bonus, it's the relocation, it's the 401k matching, it's the PTO, it's the title, it's the remote work capabilities. All of those things are really important too. So what happens is that means you've got a lot of negotiables. So the best case scenario is what you're actually doing is you're trading your highest level objectives for their lowest importance or lowest cost, and vice versa. So then if you do it very well in these more complex negotiations, neither of you actually should feel like you've given up a lot. You actually should get that optimal result, right? Where it's, a title costs them nothing, but it'll help me get my next raise. PTO maybe is really important to me because I want to travel a lot, but giving me an extra 5 isn't super costly, and they're willing to flex there. But then the salary might be a little lower, but then the relocation fee might be higher. So all of these things can be negotiated. And so, and just as a sidetrack, just because I mentioned it, what's really interesting is most people shy away from talking about all those things because very intuitively, naturally, they think, well, I'm already asking for more money. I definitely don't want to be asking for more of X, Y, Z, all these other things. And it's actually the opposite. If I say I want $75,000 and I focus the entire conversation on that, then really it's a fixed sum, right? And so every dollar you give me more is a dollar less in your budget and a dollar more in my pocket. But if we're talking about 7 things at once, that allows for that trading. That allows for the things that don't cost you much to give to me that I value, and vice versa. And so that is counterintuitive, and that kind of all goes together as well, that you've really got to be thinking at the whole picture. And that's where you reach that cliche, which I hate to use, but is often, is often a good one, is with a win-win, right? The idea where you're trying to find things that are valuable to you and to me. And that only comes from having some of that empathy we talked about earlier.
Going a little bit of a different direction, in Persuade, you emphasize self-influence before influencing others. What does that really mean, and what does it look like in real life?
So I think that, that book and kind of our influencing model is really about understanding how people make decisions in order to be able to persuade others and influence others. And so really, and this is kind of emotional intelligence 101, it's really understanding what you're trying to achieve, being clear about that, understanding how you make your own decisions, all that you have to understand before you try to influence others, right? And so the idea about influencing others is, in a sense, it's very difficult to do at a very high level, but it's quite simple to understand, right? People make decisions. Typically, credibility is a factor, and so if you're credible, people will listen to you. Typically, emotion's a factor. People make decisions emotionally, and then they justify them rationally. Typically, some logic is important to help justify it, but there are more or less compelling ways to communicate it, right? So a really good, powerful story can really resonate, and listing 15 pieces of data can sound really interesting, but can get lost very quickly. And then finally, you have to really create an environment where it's easy for other people to say yes. And so I think if you kind of understand how people make decisions, how you make decisions, and you come in with kind of that emotional intelligence, that self-awareness, I think that's where it starts. I think all too often people are trying to accomplish something, but they're not very clear on what they actually want to accomplish, right? And so you need to have that precision in order to then be able to draft that negotiation strategy and the influencing strategy.
How can we tell if what we're asking for or what we want or what we want to achieve is more emotionally driven versus rationally? Because you just said, if we make an emotional decision, we can then justify it. But how do we even know what we want isn't purely based off of emotions or being rational?
And that's tough. I think there's not necessarily one specific way to make sure of that, but I would say if we go back to the negotiations process, not an event, over time, right? So emotional reactions tend to be immediate, right? And so what happens is, and that's one of the things that, for example, one of the lessons I remember that, one of the reasons I came to Shapiro Negotiations 15 years ago was to work with Ron. One of the things he talked about a lot, he learned early on in his career, and I learned from him, ironically, he continued to pass on, was the willingness to show some vulnerability. Again, there's some negotiations where you can't, but for the most part, it is helpful and actually welcomes others to share vulnerability. And one way to do that is to say, I'm not sure, I'll get back to you. And so that gets to the fact that we are emotional. And so when people say remove emotion from negotiations, it's impossible. We shouldn't be emotional beings. It's just simply not possible. You're not removing it, you're managing it. So in a very, to be very specific, I ask more money, you say, no, we can't do that right now. Well, if we allow the emotions to get the best of us and we're not prepared enough, we might say that's really disappointing. And then what you may say next will either hurt you to get it at all. You know what? Screw it. I'll just keep working like this. It's never going to happen anyways. And that would mean that you're probably never going to get a raise. Or the exact opposite, where you say, well, that's it, I'm done. If I can't get this raised by the end of next week, I'm leaving. Again, two extreme examples, but showing what emotion will do. If you thought about it before you did that and you kind of role played a little bit, then rather than going to either extreme, it would be a thoughtful response, right? You're not thinking about your response in the heat of the peak emotion and in the heat of the negotiation. You're certainly going to say something that's more well thought through and likely to achieve a better result. So that's where you might say, what's the plan we can put in place to achieve this or something like that. And so to me, that's the example of emotion and the role that it plays. In the short term, you're managing it. You're prepared, you're thinking about what to say. And if you aren't prepared, there's lots of things that you just simply can't prepare for. Let me get back to you is a very reasonable thing to say that I think often people are afraid to say because they think they're going to sound weak. But the reality is, I mean, if the negotiation, the way people perceive others and the credibility they have is based on the entire body of work. So if you come in well prepared, you're well spoken, you're succinct, you communicate with conviction, every now and then saying, I'll get back to you, let me think more about that is certainly not it's not a weakness. And if anything, it gives strength to when then you do say with confidence, I need this in order to move forward.
How much of a volley back and forth is appropriate in a negotiation? And then also back to the emotion part of it, how often do you see if emotions towards the end going, oh, I just want this over with, fine, whatever you're saying is fine?
So the volume of the negotiation, so it's hard to say, and there's so many variables. So it's hard to answer that, but I can give at least a piece of information that'll be helpful, which is in a negotiation, you typically, so you see movements in smaller increments as you get closer to a deal done. So just as an example, I'm buying a used car on the side of the road is the easiest way to describe this. And it says $10,000 OBO, right? Or best offer. And you come in and say, well, you're inviting an offer, so I'll give you $5,000. And the person says, no, it's 10,000. And so you say, okay, I'll give you 6. And they say, I'll give you 75. I'll do it for 7,500. I mean, these are big moves. But then people start moving, not in thousands, maybe in hundreds or in $50 increments. And so that's when the volume is telling you that they're getting close to their bottom line. Now, of course, that also means that if you're a very shrewd negotiator, you might use those smaller increments to signal, as you should, that you're close to the bottom line, whether you are or aren't. But of course, that is the way to kind of gauge typically whether there's a lot of volume still left or not. Which is if the increments are still large, that's the other side signaling there's still some room to move. But the one thing you have to be then careful of is what you then brought up after, which is what we call deal fever, right? And so deal fever is right if you spend 2 months on this negotiation, you've invested so much time that either will happen usually is that you'll kind of keep negotiating, even if it's no longer a good deal for you because you invested so much time. And even if it's a sunk cost at this point. And the others, or you might get deal fatigue, which is, just let me be done with it. Either of those they're emotional and you want to avoid those. And so I would say one of the things that we recommend in the preparation is we write down, look, what's my highest goal here? And what's my walk away? And you write those down because then when deal fever kicks in or deal fatigue kicks in, then you can look at those numbers you wrote down a month ago or 2 months ago or 6 months ago when you were totally objective about it. And you can see, does this deal still make sense? Right? Because sometimes walking away is better. So if this is below your walk away, doesn't mean you absolutely walk away, but it certainly means you take a step back and say, I wrote down I wouldn't do less than this, and I'm considering less than this. Why? And so that's if you write that down and you can refer back to it, it's a good way to be objective about, am I still going in the right direction or not?
We spent a lot of our time talking about salary negotiations and jobs, but then you just brought up buying a car. But there's really so many different ways there could be negotiations in our day to day lives, right? So for someone that's like, I'm terrible at this, how do I sharpen my sword of negotiating? What are some ways that we could kind of try it, practice as we're just functioning through our day?
Well, so yeah, I mean, we negotiate every day. I mean, our expertise at SNI is really about business negotiations, right? So they're mergers and acquisitions, or sales teams, or procurement teams, and that's who we typically train. But those same skill applies to absolutely anything: buying a car, for salary negotiation, all those things, right? So um, the practice, if you think about it, so everything technically potentially could be negotiable, right? But when you think about it, the extreme is if you go to the convenience store and you're buying a pack of gum and it's $1, the cost of it doesn't really warrant negotiation. Is it even worth the time to negotiate a dollar pack of gum? And the likelihood that the cashier is going to negotiate is very low. So we don't typically do it. We just take it for granted, right? The price. But if you think about it, it's like ways to do it, for example, where you don't care that much about the negotiation. Well, telecom providers, your internet provider, most of them anywhere in the world really typically don't have the best customer service ratings, right? So, for example, trying it out there and calling your customer service provider and trying to negotiate a better rate for your internet or for your phone, is an easy way to do it. But I mean, there's a million ways to do it. I think if you think about it in your job, you're negotiating for more budget, you're negotiating for buy-in, you're negotiating with your colleagues to potentially work on a project together. You're trying to influence them to do that. So there's really countless ones. And so what you're thinking about is, are these kind of the transactional types? Well, will I see this person again or not? And so if you're buying a house, you're buying a car, you probably will never see the person again. Now, it doesn't mean you go out of your way to be a horrible person, but it means that you may care less about the relationship. But certainly when you get to the ones that are your professional ones, if you're a procurement agent working with a partner, a vendor, that's the beginning of a relationship. If you're a salesperson that's selling something, that's the beginning of a relationship with a client. So those we have to be more thoughtful about the relationship. And so you kind of want to try them in different places. And I would tell everyone to think about prepare, probe, propose. Prepare, spend time. It's the only aspect of the negotiation you have control. You don't control tariffs. You don't control the economy. You don't control any of those things. But you can control your preparation. The second is probing, like I said, and really should be combined with listening. Ask great questions, be thoughtful about it, and really listen. And then for proposing, you want to really, in the preparation phase, you want to have come up with proposals that you can justify based on precedents. And so if you kind of think of those three things together, and that negotiation is a process, not an event, and you practice that, it is absolutely a muscle that you can develop.
When a negotiation doesn't go our way, how can we reset without internalizing it as failure or shame?
Yeah, it's a great question. That's kind of the emotion. Well, it's I think here this is more kind of a life lesson that I think we all should remember, and me included. And it's that if you think of, let's say, a baseball analogy, right? The best players in baseball history are batting just over 300 average, like 333, which would be one third of the at bats you have. If you got a hit in those, you'd be a Hall of Famer, one of the greatest players of all time. That's batting one third, right? If you think of like a basketball player, how many they shoot, or a hockey player, soccer player, like you think of it in sports analogies, you're the absolute best player in the world, or Roger Federer at a commencement speech. I'm a big tennis fan, tennis player, and Roger Federer at a commencement speech some years ago, where he talked about that he's the best player in the world. Some say the best of all time, and he won only a little bit more than 50% of his matches in his career. Right? It wasn't like or 50% of his sets as well. So it wasn't like he was winning 99% of his games. Right? And so if you think about that, that's the difference between being good and maybe not going great. But in all cases, we fail, we don't perform at our highest level. And so I would say it's a matter of understanding that that is a lesson learned, and that's absolutely to be expected, and par for the course, rather than to necessarily take it emotionally, because even the best negotiators will make mistakes. Happens all the time. I mean, again, I came to this company to work with Ron Shapiro 15 years ago. He's as good of a negotiator as I've seen, who studied it and done it for, at that point, 40 years in his career. I mean, the way he said it is he wrote multiple books because it was based on all the mistakes he made that he wanted to pass on those learnings. So if he can do it, certainly I think we're all should be allowed to make mistakes. And I think it's about how you bounce back, what you learn from them. And I think the one big thing though is not making the same mistake twice, right? It's okay to have not had a successful negotiation, but if you did it because you weren't prepared, it would be unacceptable for you not to be prepared for your next negotiation. That's where then you should be frustrated with yourself, because then you're making the same mistake twice.
And what's one empowering belief we should carry into every negotiation, whether it's for a raise, a relationship, or a new chapter in life?
That's a good question. Generally, what we find is that people overestimate their weaknesses and they underestimate their I guess we think we're more powerful, we have less leverage than we have, right? So to do it again, I think we overestimate our weaknesses and we underestimate our strengths, and then the equal for the other party. So what happens is we run this simulation that really strikes me, because we've done this all over the world, and there's one where both parties come in feeling like they have very little leverage. And what's interesting is they have very little leverage, it's true, but the other side has very little leverage as well. And it's very rare. I mean, I've done this hundreds, if not thousands of times, where either party will ask questions or even consider the possibility the other side doesn't have a lot of leverage. They're completely focused exclusively on how little leverage they have and their weaknesses. They don't think about their strengths, and they absolutely do not think about the weaknesses of the other party. And so I think those are things that certainly for negotiation in life, that it's we may be stronger than we think we are, but that does require preparation. That requires getting the most out of what we have. But I think that from an empowerment perspective, and certainly we talked about women earlier, that's the purpose of having a process. It's to have conviction, it's to give confidence, and to develop those skills to allow you to achieve results. And so it's certainly doable, but it starts with preparation, putting in the hard work. There's really no alternative to that.